Good morning. I'm excited to be here with you all today and be a part of this wonderful celebration commemorating 20 years of being Opening and Affirming Church. I stand before you this morning as a member in discernment in the UCC, which means I'm in the discernment process with the hope of being ordained as an authorized minister in the United Church of Christ. I stand before you as a lesbian who has been deeply and profoundly harmed by religious leaders, institutions, and family members. As a recovering Southern Baptist, I know firsthand the harm that can be done in the name of God. I've spent 27 years of my life believing what I had been taught by everyone around me, that God hated me and there was nothing I could do about that. I stand before you as a member of the LGBT community whose work in the world is to help people heal from spiritual abuse and trauma. I stand before you and say thank you. I am grateful for churches like this who have done the often difficult work of becoming opening and affirming. I thank you for being willing to do the hard work even when it wasn't popular and even when you knew it would cause strife among you as well as in the community in which you live. It is clear that it was not an easy task, especially 20 years ago. Yet I'm not sure it has gotten any easier 20 years later. Yes, in some places and churches, it might be easier than it was then. But these days, there is still so much work to do. While the LGBTQIA community continues to fight for our rights, we seem to be losing, or at risk of losing, the rights that we've already gained. The decisions that have been made recently in the United Methodist Church have been deeply traumatic for the LGBT community. We seem to be moving backwards in time and injustice instead of forward. Our country seems to be a place where deceit and divisions, hate and violence are encouraged. Where is the love, people? I feel it here this morning. How do we love one another in life-giving ways in times such as these? Let's look to our sacred text to see what Jesus can teach us about loving one another. Our text from today comes from the book of John, chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. Jesus gives the disciples a new commandment, to love one another. Then Jesus says to them, "Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. This is how everyone will know you are my disciples, when they see the love that you have for each other." So let's unpack this a little. But first, let me give you some context. Our text today is set within the scene of Jesus' Last Supper. And one of the most interesting things about this text is its location. Just prior to the text, Judas has left the room to go and betray Jesus. And Jesus has told the disciples that he only has a little bit of time left with them, and where he is going, they cannot go. And then just after the text, Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, denies that he even knows Jesus on 3 separate occasions. I don't know about you, but it seems really important here that Jesus gives this new commandment, telling the disciples to love one another, knowing that Judas was going to betray him, knowing that this was his end was near, and knowing that Peter was going to deny him 3 times before the morning. So let's break down the commandment into 3 smaller parts. The first part, Jesus gives his disciples, and us, I believe, is a new commandment to love one another. What might Jesus mean here when he tells the disciples to love one another? What might that look like? I don't think Jesus was simply saying generally, "Now y'all be nice to each other while I'm gone." And I think the command has much different connotations if Jesus is saying it generally than if he is saying love one another in the context of betrayal and denial. It's easy to love the people who are like us, who think like us, and share the same interests, beliefs, and values. But it is much harder to love someone who has just betrayed us, or someone we deeply love. It's much harder to love someone who has been a really close friend and confidant, maybe for a really long time, who then denies they even know us. We have to dig much deeper in order to find love in our hearts and to be kind and respectful to those who have wronged us so deeply. Yet, given the timing of when Jesus makes this command, this seems to be precisely the depth of love that Jesus wanted the disciples to have for each other. It is the depth and breadth of love that Jesus had for his disciples and for us. The second part of the commandment is, as I have loved you, so should you love one another. Now, this second part raises the bar on how to love one another and how wide to draw the circle. Now, I'm not talking about a circle that indicates exclusion of who's inside the circle and who's outside the circle, but widening the circle in its ever-widening space of inclusion. So what do we know about how Jesus loved? And how might we reimagine what it means to love one another in the context of how Jesus loved, even if we're not sure what we believe about Jesus? The first thing we know is that his ministry was a gospel of full inclusion. It was countercultural. He was constantly crossing boundaries and borders into familiar and unfamiliar territory, bringing love, forgiveness, and transformation with him. Jesus went into Samaritan land and to Gentile territory. He was inside people's lives and homes, hanging out with tax collectors, lepers, and a whole variety of folks on the margins that he wasn't supposed to be associated with. Yet he did not exclude anyone. Jesus was amazingly compassionate and respectful. He welcomed everyone continuously, widened the circle of who he made connections with, and even those whom society disrespected and undervalued. The sick, women, children, widows, the poor. There are lots of stories in the Gospels where he loved very deeply, healed people, and stood up for those who were oppressed by going against what the social norms were in his time. And he was always encouraging people towards love. Jesus met people exactly where they were without judgment. He was a profoundly good listener, not only to his disciples, but to everyone he came in contact with, even the Pharisees. Jesus listened without judgment, and attentive listening can go a long way in helping people feel seen, heard, and valued. Jesus loved people in ways that mattered to each of them. Sometimes it's really important for us to ask people what they need instead of assuming that we know. For example, a little while back, I was reading a book, The 5 Love Languages. The 5 love languages that this author speaks about is words of affirmation, physical touch, receiving gifts, quality time, or acts of service. So if my love language and the way that I feel loved is by words of affirmation from other people, and you are somebody I love and you never give me affirmations, words of affirmations, do I feel loved by you? Often not. So if I'm giving words of affirmation to someone else, and that's not their love language, then we're always sort of off kilter, right? Jesus was patient, slow to anger, and he chose the high road no matter what the situation. For example, when Judas left to betray Jesus, Jesus didn't sit around and badmouth Judas or getting the disciples all riled up about how evil Judas was. Instead, Jesus chose to focus on what the disciples needed at that time. He did what was best for them. Elizabeth Johnson writes that loving one another as Jesus had loved encompasses anything from the mundane, like serving one another or washing the disciples' feet, to heroic acts of great risk, even to the point of giving one's life for another. Now, I'm not asking you or telling you or advocating for you to go out and do high-risk tasks for one another. I'm simply sharing some examples of the way that Jesus loved. It does seem clear, however, that loving one another as Jesus loved and still loves is loving at a whole other level than what we might ordinarily do on our own. Yet to complicate things even further, Jesus adds a third part to the new commandment. This third part reads, "They will know you are my followers by the love you have for one another." Although I don't think this part is exclusively for followers, I don't think Jesus is simply talking about a happy feeling kind of love here, although that can be a part of it. I believe the kind of love Jesus talks about here goes much deeper than that. I think Jesus is talking about a way of treating people, a way of putting ourselves on the line to love each other and stand up for each other. It's about continuing Jesus' kind of love and impact in the world. I believe Jesus is talking about love as action. But what kind of acts of love would set us apart in that way? Our approach to loving one another, I think, would have to be very intentional and very countercultural. So what might that look like? It might mean using our imaginations and getting creative about how to love one another in new and surprising ways. It could mean that we can look at boundaries and dividing lines, not as the things that divide us, but as the place where things meet. It might look like learning to love people in ways that matter to them. So what does this have to do with our celebration of opening and affirming? I think these three concepts, three parts of Jesus' commandment apply to everything, right? So what does it look like if you're putting it in the context of loving one another and loving the LGBT community? Doing the work of becoming open and affirming says a lot about this church's heart for justice. However, being an opening and affirming church and doing that well is just the beginning. There is still so much work to do. Here are some ways that you can love one another with regards to the LGBTQIA community. Find ways to connect with the community in ways you never have before. Listen to their stories. Get involved in each other's lives and make a difference. Get to know one another. Be sensitive to family issues, God issues, restroom issues. If you're not sure what those are, then ask me or someone you know. We are still being denied housing and jobs because of who we are, or we're losing them. Stand up for the rights of others. Vote. Do whatever you can to help us not lose the rights we've already gained. Call or write letters to your legislators. Make sure folks know that you are a safe place for them and that this church is as well. Meet people exactly where they are without judgment. Go, be, love. Love one another. Love one another as Jesus loved. Love others in ways that matter to them. Be countercultural. Stand out in the world by the love you have for one another. What is one way, big or small, that each of us can choose love in a situation that we usually don't? Or choose to be love in the world like we never have been before? What is one thing that each of us might do over the course of this next week to try and encompass all three parts of Jesus' new commandment? Let us go out this week and not only reimagine love, but go be love in the world in new and exciting, deeper ways. Ways that make people take notice of the love we have for one another. In our church families, we have the opportunity to offer love and belonging to the LGBTQIA community. We have the opportunity to offer them a place where they can be loved and embraced for exactly who they are, which can result in deep and profound healing. And we have the very unique opportunity to help the LGBT community get back or reclaim what they were told they would never have, their love for God and from God. I will conclude with this brief reflection that I wrote 5 years ago after spending the day with a transgender choir called Transcendence Choir in Oakland, California. The choir had spent the day singing to us and talking about and modeling how they had been able to get back what they were told they would never have. My reflection is titled, Get Back What You Were Told You Would Never Have. How exactly do we get back what we were told we would never have when we may have never had it in the first place? How do we get back what we were told we would never have when the trauma in your body is so loud that you can't find or hear your own voice, much less the still, small voice of God? How do you get back what you were told you would never have when you can't seem to unlearn the God of your earthly father? When you wonder if you'll ever be able to grow into feeling capable, no matter how hard you try or how hard you pray? How do you get back what you were told you would never have when the God of your understanding seems to default to the God of your father? Maybe for me, it isn't about getting back. Maybe it's about learning to claim for myself the God of my own understanding and the love for God and from God. Maybe I just have to be patient to claim that I am growing into feeling capable even when I don't feel capable. I have observed many folks that week living in the love of God, truly living in the Spirit of God, where their love is deep for God and from God, and it overflows to everyone around them. Maybe, just maybe, if it's possible for them, then it's possible for me. And maybe I too can claim what I was told that I would never have, the love of God. I wrote that 5 years ago. And what you all have shown me in this short period of time in learning about your process and who you are as an opening and affirming church is what gets people in the LGBT community to this place and back to God.